This meeting of the Norwood City Council is hereby called to order. Please rise for the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, is the body we congregate in these council chambers. We pray for thy divine guidance that we may do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everyone. And we all survived Snowmageddon today. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Here.
Mr. Clark.
Here.
Mrs. Stickley.
Here.
Mr. Blair.
Here.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Here.
Mr. Sanker.
Here.
Mr. Mumper.
Here.
All members are present. We have a couple of requests to amend the agenda. The first is a letter from the mayor regarding executive session that would be added to communication number 3. We have a committee report from the Housing, Health, and Recreation that we would add under reports of standing committees of council. And we have, at my request, we have a person who wants to address the ordinance number 6, and rather than have that person sit through all of the grass cutting ordinances, that we would move that up under G, under request to address council on agenda items, if that's not an objection. Mr. Clark.
I'll move to amend the agenda as you stated.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall. Yes. Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We'll move on to minutes of the previous meeting, and minutes of the January 26, 2016. Your pleasure. Mr. Bunsall.
Yeah, I move to approve the minutes as if read.
Seconded by Mr. Clark. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We do have a request to address council regarding the ordinance amending section 331.03 of the codified ordinances. So, Mr. Henson, would you please come forward, give us your name and address, and you'll have 5 minutes to speak.
Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm Frank Henson, and I'm the president of Queen City Bike. And I'm here to speak shortly about the 3-foot ordinance. Queen City Bike is Greater Cincinnati's only member-based bicycle advocacy organization. Our mission is to build strong and active communities by promoting the bicycle as a safe, accessible, and low-stress choice for everyday transportation. We work to make our streets safer for bicyclists. A bicycle safety policy that has gained significant interest and activity recently is 3 feet or safe passing laws. These laws seek to ensure that when passing bicycles, motor vehicles allow adequate space to avoid sideswiping the bike or causing the bicyclist to overcorrect to avoid a vehicle. The passing ordinance will create a legal framework to protect bicyclists who are buzzed from behind or swiped from the side. It also establishes a less arbitrary standard. The way it is now, we're guessing, but if you put a fixed distance, that gives something for people to shoot for. And it also raises the awareness of the importance of safe passing. The Board of Trustees of Queen City Bike endorses and supports the proposed 3-foot safety ordinance for the city of Norwood. I'd also like to add that with the coming development of the Wasson Way Trail, there's going to be a whole lot of cyclists that will be coming back and forth from that facility, and a 3-foot safety ordinance will help ensure their safety. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Henson. We'll now move on to consideration of that ordinance, an ordinance amending section 331.03 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances, overtaking 3-foot passing distance from bicyclists, driver's duties, and amending section 313.09, driver's duties upon approaching ambiguous or non-working traffic signal. What's your pleasure? Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, I move that we have the first reading of the ordinance.
Is there a second to that? Seconded by Mr. Clark. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Hanahan?
I have a couple of questions. Looking at this, I do have concerns on how you're going to enforce this, how you're going to enforce 3 feet. I know that this is right now in legislation for the state of Ohio, and it has once failed, I was told today. And I myself would like to look into what happened with that and why it failed. But my other question came from the penalties. When I look at the penalties on here, where did those come from? Because, you know, when it's talking about if you're convicted of other unrelated offenses, then it becomes a 4th degree misdemeanor or a 3rd degree misdemeanor. And the other offenses aren't related to this at all. And I want to know how that works. Or why it is the way it is, and I don't know who to ask.
Yeah.
Mr. Moore,
I'll just say
can
it.
you, Mr. Moore, can you answer that? Or?
Yeah.
I can give it a shot. As far as enforcement, I would defer to the police department, but I think it's basically if they observe someone passing within what it appears to be 3 feet, they will cite the person, issue a ticket. As far as the penalties, it's kind of a standard. It's a minor misdemeanor unless they've been basically a traffic hazard within the previous year, in which case you get enhanced penalties.
So,
Mrs. Hanahan, follow?
sorry. So if I got a ticket for rolling through a stop sign the same year, my penalty goes up. Is that correct?
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Mr. Mumper?
Could we get comments from the mayor since he's a former police officer?
Former, I don't know if he might still be. Yes, Mr. Mayor.
I can assure you I didn't write a lot of tickets. I understand the intent of this ordinance. I followed the news just like anybody else. There was a loss of life for a woman who was under some sort of influence, struck and killed a bicyclist, and left the scene, and I totally understand that. I'm not so sure how enforceable this is. Not only that, I see issues with, you know, we don't have wide streets all over, and I don't know how you judge 3 feet. There are some motorists who crowd bicycles. By the same token, there are bicyclists who get out in the middle of the street and say, I'm a bicyclist just like you, and you'll have to wait for me. So it works both ways. One of the things that concerns me more than anything, if there would be an accident, and the bicyclist says, well, you have an ordinance that's 3 feet, and then does this add liability on somebody who may not have been in fault to begin with? And that would have been the driver. So I like you, Ms. Hanrahan, I have some distinction with the penalty phase of it. I also have some discussions about the enforcement of the ordinance. The gentleman is right, Wasson Way will be coming through, and there will be bicyclists coming through, and it is a really nice thing to have. Wasson Way, the bicycle trails are absolutely fantastic, and that's what those trails are made for. And I'm not saying bicyclists don't have a right to be on the street. They certainly do. I'm not so sure anymore we come up with laws and ordinances that are really not enforceable just to make us feel good. So I would like to see council really consider this. And I spoke to Mr. Bonzel prior to the meeting, being he asked for this legislation. And I asked him if he would just settle for one reading so we can discuss it more, and he said yes. So I think it certainly deserves more discussion.
Mr. Mumper?
I have a question. Does the bicyclist have responsibility for staying within 3 feet of the curb? Or can they go wherever they want?
Mr. Moore, can you help us out on that? or Mr.
Yeah,
Bonzo?
I was gonna say, currently, I mean, after talking to Mr. Gary, and we kind of reviewed this, I mean, but bicycles, they have duties to, responsibilities as well on the road. And one of the responsibilities in Norwood is that they have to stay, I think, as right as possible, to the lane. They can't just ride, if for no reason, they can't just ride in the center of the left part of the lane. Let's just say there's glass in the road or something else. I mean, of course, I would think that would be a reasonable reason to avoid glass not being on the right side of the road. But yeah, they definitely do not have to, I mean, bicycles have responsibilities too. This is not just, it's nothing really that new. And as far as liability, I mean, to me, if I'm, you know, when my wife was hit on her bicycle back in September, you know, the police studied exactly what happened, studied what the motorist did and what she did, and was able to make a conclusion based on that about who was at fault. And I would think the same thing would happen in this case as well. I would think the police would make a reasonable declaration of who was at fault based on what each party did. And if a motorist hits a bicycle, so if a bicyclist is going straight in the same lane and a motorist hits them from behind, they're at fault now no matter what. I mean, they hit the bicyclist. So I personally don't know where the extra liability is going to come from if there would be. And, you know, one more thing I'd just like to say is that, you know, as the mayor alluded to, you know, on Saturday I had the honor to join 600 other people that were riding in honor of Michael Prater. He was killed by riding his bicycle in southeastern Hamilton County last week. This ordinance wouldn't exactly, you know, the lady was on, there was some extenuating circumstances the mayor alluded to, but, you know, there are more bicyclists killed in Ohio than there really should be. I mean, I think in 2013 there were 12, and then there were over 1,000 that were injured. And so this ordinance is just, it helps to establish a distance to allow just greater safety on the road, and just helps protect people. There are so many times that a motorist might zoom by somebody on a bicycle, and unintentionally they might actually hit the bicyclist when they were just trying to go by them. They didn't realize they weren't giving a safe distance, or they were just doing it on purpose. And this law would ensure that there would be, that at least the education's out there, that you have to have 3 feet. And then the last thing I'd like to say, just as far as like the state of Ohio, I mean, there's laws all the time that are proposed and go through committee, which this law did last year. It went through committee, and it doesn't make it to a vote on the Senate floor or the House floor, and that's what happened to this one. I wouldn't say it failed, I just would say that it didn't make it all the way. It was voted unanimously, in the committee that it was considered in, it was approved unanimously. And our law, the law that we would have right here is pretty much identical copy. And there's another move this year in the state of Ohio to pass it as well. And the reason why, even if Ohio passes it, the reason why we want Norwood to pass it as well, so it can go to mayor's court. If there were a ticket, it wouldn't have to go downtown. And yeah, that's all I have, so thank you all. And again, this is just first reading today. I mean, I'm okay with us doing the same thing we did in proper solicitation, having 3 readings of it in 3 consecutive council meetings.
Yes. Mrs. Stickley?
This is a question for the law director. What is the cost of putting on an ordinance in our books? I mean, does it cost the city money to do so? Like, is there publication fees or anything like that? And then what is the return as far as like what we would get back in mayor's court if we just didn't wait to see what the state of Ohio were to do?
Mr. Moore, can you answer that for us, please?
Thank you, Madam President. There is a cost. We're required to advertise any ordinance that's passed in the Inquirer. I don't remember the cost. It's by the column inch or the word, but so there is a cost there. At some point, I hope that we'll be able to codify the ordinance that have been passed since 2011. The total cost for that, the best estimate I have is probably between $10,000 and $15,000. So, I mean, this ordinance out of that would be a page, which is, you know, one minuscule part of that. So there is a cost there. I have no way to speculate what kind of, the idea of collecting any fines. This may never actually be, no one may actually be cited. It may be a lot of warning situations. It may be, oh, you know, this is what we found. I have no way to know if or when anyone might be cited under it.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Mumper?
This 3 feet issue, we once spent parts of about 3 different council meetings talking about an ordinance that required cars not to park within 3 feet of a driveway. Well, it got to be a laugher, really, because the police weren't going to carry a tape measure or a yardstick or anything. It was just going to be in their best judgment how far 3 feet was. So this 3 feet thing brings back that farce that we had, talking about 3 feet from a driveway when it didn't matter because it was going to be up to the individual police officer to decide. So just keep that in mind, that this 3 foot thing isn't going to be an exact science.
Thank you, Mr. Mumford. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to have the first reading. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumford.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have the first reading.
Ordinance amending Section 331.03 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances, overtaking 3-foot passing distance from bicyclists, driver's duties, and amending Section 313.09, driver's duties upon approaching ambiguous or non-working traffic signal.
Thank you. We will move on to reports of standing committees. The one that was added is Housing, Health, and Recreation. Mrs. Hanahan.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Housing, Health, and Recreation, to whom was referred the Fun Factory, leave to submit the following report. Renovations at the Fun Factory were discussed, and it was agreed upon that the renovations need to be addressed by the building and fire departments. There was discussion about installing a no standing sign in front of the Fun Factory for vehicles. We also noted that there were fire safety concerns and nuisance issues that still need to be addressed by the owner. Respectfully submitted, Marilyn Hanrahan, Chairperson.
And it was signed as well by Brandon Blair, James Bonsall, and Tammy Stickley.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, I move that we accept the report from the committee.
Seconded by Mr. Clark. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumford.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Before we consider the third reading of ordinances creating Section 759.06 improper solicitation, we have 2 requests to address council. The first is Ann Householder. Would you like to come before council, give us your name and address, and you'll have 5 minutes to address.
Good evening, my name is Ann Householder. I live at 2005 Mills Avenue, and I'm a physician at the Veterans Administration. I'm speaking to you tonight about this ordinance, both as a concerned citizen of Norwood and as a physician who cares for veterans. One of the classic sort of examples in this is the person who lies about being a veteran. And I want to make sure that all of you know that veterans cannot be identified by their race, their gender, their age, their occupation, the way that they're dressed, or the way that they talk. So I have deep concerns about this legislation in terms of bias, in terms of who decides who's lying, and as a citizen, I'm worried about that being improperly acted upon, that people's bias about who is or isn't what they're claiming to be would be used, and as a taxpayer in Norwood, I'm concerned that if we were to do this justly, if they were to fairly figure out who was in fact lying or not lying, that the expense that you would have to go to figure out that, given that, like I said, for the classic example of I'm a homeless vet, there is no age or gender, race, or persona that could help you identify that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Householder. The second is Meredith Owensby. Again, if you'll give us your name and address, and you'll have 5 minutes to address council. Thank you.
My name is Meredith Owensby, and I live at 2024 Mills Avenue. I am the co-director of Lydia's House, and I bring you greetings from that community of women and children who are emerging from homelessness. I left them in the midst of a Mardi Gras celebration to address you this evening. I would urge you to vote against this anti-panhandling ordinance currently under consideration. Working with some of the poorest of the poor, I can assure you that further criminalization of their actions is the last thing people who panhandle need. Rather than addressing the root causes of poverty or addiction, you are instead adding another punishable offense to a list of many, a charge which would impede that person's effort to secure work or housing in the future. I have heard from the law director and chief of police that the law would be applied selectively, but that brings me no comfort. Why are you proposing a law that, under the best case scenario you can provide, would mean different things for different people? You already have trespassing laws, harassment laws, and any number of laws that can be used to deal with individuals who are legitimately a threat to others. I urge you to use them rather than adding an unnecessary law aimed at a small handful of individuals. This proposal, at its heart, is aimed at silencing the most vocal of the poor. Are we really such a fragile community that we cannot bear to be asked for assistance? Is our annoyance at encountering a person asking loudly for money really worth inflicting charges upon them that will potentially follow them for life? I think we're better than this. I'd ask you not to add to the heavy burdens people in poverty already bear. Being asked for money is a momentary annoyance perhaps, but it is nothing compared to the hardship of the lives lived by those doing the asking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Owensby. We will now move on to consideration of the third reading of the ordinance creating section 759.06, improper solicitation. Mr. Sanker,
Make a motion to have the third reading.
is there a second? Seconded by Mrs. Hanahan. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have the third reading.
Ordinance creating section 759.06, improper solicitation.
Is there a motion to pass? That was the motion for the third reading. Mr. Sanker,
I make a motion that we pass the ordinance.
seconded by Mrs. Hanahan. Is there any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, so first off, I just wanted to thank the speakers that came out tonight to speak about the ordinance. I think that I definitely appreciate, I know there's a perspective that the speakers have that I know I don't have in general. So, but with that being said, I'm going to vote yes on the ordinance today. And I'm going to vote yes because, it's an ordinance that the city of Cincinnati's had for many, many, many years. It's an ordinance that's been tested in court. I know that there's people out there that are struggling, but the ordinance specifically says that if somebody's just out with a sign and, they're just sitting on the ground, that this ordinance is not targeting them. It specifically exempts them. So I just want to say I'm going to vote yes for that reason. But I can respect if other people don't.
Is there any other discussion? Mrs. Hanahan.
I also want to thank those who came to speak. I also am going to vote yes for this, and one of the reasons, just last Saturday a week ago, it's at midnight and I'm going through Wendy's and all of a sudden I have this gentleman come and stick his head in my driver's side window asking for money. And I just find it very threatening and intimidating. And I do think we need to put some limits on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Hanahan. Any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to pass the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We'll move on to introductory readings of ordinances. The first is an ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. And this one is the That begins with Bell Street under section 1. 4217 Bell Street, because there are numerous ordinances, so we wanted to make sure that you had the one that we were considering. Mr. Clark.
I'd move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings of this ordinance.
Seconded by Mrs. Stickley. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Hanahan.
Thank you, Madam President. I would just like to ask, why are these declared emergency?
I will attempt to answer that, and if it's not correct, Mr. Moore can correct me, but throughout the year, the health department has usually abandoned houses where people have called in complaints. The health department has sent them orders to cut the grass. It has not been cut, so the city cuts it. Twice a year, we can attach a lien onto the property so that if the property is sold, then the cost for that grass cutting can come back to the city. And it only is 2 times a year when that can be attached. And so if we miss the deadline this time, we have to wait till the next time. Is that correct, Mr. Moore?
Sounds right.
I only know that from experience. There's no reason in the world why you would ever know that. Yes, Mr. Mumford.
Just a comment, I noticed that some of these addresses are on other ordinances here. I guess that's because they had to do this for like
Multiple
3 or
times.
4 months in a row. I just never noticed it before, but I was looking at all the ones in my ward, and then
They're multiple.
one was on my street, and then it was repeated, and I thought, wow. So, I think we ought to promote the lawnmower repair shop on 4th Avenue so that these people can cut their grass.
Thank you, Mr. Mumford. Is there any other discussion? Yes, Mrs. Stickley.
What is the cost to the city to attach a lien on the property?
I'm not
Is
sure
there
there is.
financial?
Mr. Moore, do you know?
I would defer to Mr. Mumper, actually.
It just has to be recorded,
I think
$28.
There's no cost?
You don't have to
It's just recorded on the deed?
Yeah.
Yes,
follow
Mrs.
up.
Stickley.
You don't have to file anything in like municipal court?
Mr. Mumford?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to suspend the rules. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all 3 readings.
Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Clark.
Move to pass the ordinance.
Seconded by Mr. Bonsall. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Is this one 16? Yep. Next ordinance is an ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. And this one, section 1, begins with 2250 Buxton Avenue. Mr. Clark.
I'd move that we suspend the rules and have all 3 readings of this ordinance.
Seconded by Mr. Excuse me. Blair. Suspended. Seconded by Mr. Blair. I'm trying not to cough in the microphone. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Call the roll, please.
You have all 3 readings.
have all three
right.
readings. I'm a mess.
Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Clark,
Move to pass the ordinance.
seconded by Mr. Mumper. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Next is an ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. And this one also starts with 2250 Buxton and is followed by 2171 Glenside. Mr. Bonsall,
Yeah, I move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
seconded by Mrs. Stickley. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all three readings.
Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Ponsall,
I move that we pass the ordinance.
seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Next is an ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. And this one, section 1 is 2109 Cathedral Avenue. Mr. Sanker,
Madam President, I recommend we'd have all three readings by caption only.
seconded by Mr. Mumper. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all three readings.
Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Clark,
Move to pass the ordinance.
seconded by Mr. Mumper. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hannerhan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Our final ordinance is an ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. And this one, in section 1, begins with 4417 Floral Avenue. Mrs. Stickley.
I move that we suspend the rules and have all 3 readings.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley?
Yes.
Mr. Blair?
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan?
Yes.
Mr. Sanker?
Yes.
Mr. Mumper?
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all 3 readings.
Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the clerk treasurer to certify unpaid bills for the cost of grass cutting to the Hamilton County Auditor for filing as a lien on the tax duplicate of the owners of said parcels and to be collected as other taxes and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Clark.
Move to pass the ordinance.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion?
I just had one question.
Mr. Bonsall?
So why couldn't we put these all in one ordinance and just change the amounts, like double the amounts or triple the amounts for the houses that were hit multiple times? Is there a reason why we had to have 5 different ordinances for this?
Mr. Moore, can you answer that?
No.
Fair enough.
I can tell you that again, from personal experience of being at the health department, that you're only allowed to charge the amount that it cost you to do that and not anymore. You're not allowed to make money on it. So this 221.45 has been the amount that the Public Works Department has determined that it costs them to pay the personnel and for gasoline and for the equipment necessary to cut the grass. So whether it's the 3rd time or the 1st time, it doesn't cost any more, it's the same amount. And before these are done, there are letters that are sent from Public Works to the Health Department telling them that the dates that these were done and how much it cost.
Okay. Thank you, Madam President.
I have no idea why we had to read them 5 times, but
Sorry. Thank you.
we've always done that, I don't know. That's one question I can't ask. I can't answer. I can ask it, I can't answer it. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to pass the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley?
Yes.
Mr. Blair?
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan?
Yes.
Mr. Sanker?
Yes.
Mr. Mumper?
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Take a deep breath. We have no introductory readings of resolutions, so we'll move on to administration reports. Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Madam President. I have 2 issues. The first I want to discuss with you. We attended the grand opening and ribbon cutting for Health South rehab facility down on Section Avenue this week. I was asked to speak, and they asked my wife, Marianne, to speak because she was suffered a stroke back some years and was rehabbed at Drake Health South out on Galbraith Road. It was a really nice thing. Mr. Bonza was there, Donna Lake was there, RN. Mrs. Hanrahan was there, Mark Reeves. It's a fantastic facility. It is absolutely beautiful. And when we had the meetings with them, I made a point of saying that my wife had suffered a stroke, and as a family member, had discussions on how it was and what we thought was good and what we didn't think was good. And they did everything, and it's absolutely a beautiful facility. If you know somebody who is unfortunate enough to require physical rehab for stroke, surgery, accident, or whatever, this is a first-class facility. This is really a nice place. It's all modern, wired hallways for rehabs, exercise room. It was really a nice affair. Mr. Gears was there. His daughter is Julie is a nurse practitioner, and Donna RN, so we had a lot of medical people too. But I mean, it is really a nice facility. The amazing thing about it was Marianne ran into some of the women who rehabbed her way back when, and it was an emotional meeting. So these people, the facility's nice, but the people that they have, the individuals that perform the service are nothing short of just absolutely perfect. So it's an asset to have them in our city and in this beautiful facility. With that said, as you've known in the newspaper here recently, the story has been what I almost consider a childish fight between the city of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and it regards the Metropolitan Sewer District. Right off the bat, I want to thank Keith and the Law Department for their patience with me this week, because I've not been happy about it, and I've been pressing for answers, and they've been supplying them to me. I think our obligation is we are the ratepayer, but our residents are the ones that are paying for this, their sewer bill. And if you've been around for a while, and you've been elected office, you've heard how many times, how come my water bill is so high, it's a sewer bill, and we get beat on a weekly basis. And we tell them, Mr. Gears and I attended a meeting down at Metropolitan Sewer District almost 12 years ago, and was told at that meeting, for the foreseeable future, you can look for a 7 to 10% raise every year. And they kept their word. It's a consent decree that was signed between the county and the city of Cincinnati with the federal court to stop the water from merging the sewer and the stormwater going into the creeks and rivers. And this is fine. And they have spent literally millions of dollars. Now, by no means am I criticizing or want to lay to the crews and the people who do the work for MSD, because actually we've had good luck with them. But when I see millions of dollars, just millions of dollars, that nobody can question, I don't think our ratepayers, our residents, are getting their fair share. So what I've asked to do, and we'll be what I consider exploring all options. One is to push for that our money to go into escrow. That's being researched by the law department. The other issue is now they're talking about forming this committee with the city of Cincinnati. You know what? I think Norwood should be represented. I think Norwood ought to have a say, and I think municipalities throughout this county should have a say. Because I'm telling you, if we sit back and say nothing, they'll run right over the top of us. And we'll be ignored, and we cannot be ignored. This goes back 1968. I found the ordinances that were passed, and one of the things that they said was, we have 3 different types of sewers. We have a sanitary, we have a combination, and we have storm. And the city of Cincinnati declared all of theirs combination. So all of the city of Cincinnati's sewers get paid for. All of them. In Norwood, they'll take care of the sanitary and the other one, the mixed use, okay, combination. Storm we pick up. Well, I looked at the ordinance that says sewer. It didn't specify anything. I think that's a point of contention. And I think the possibility of using this situation to leverage our position to have them to take care of all of our sewers is the way to go. If, in fact, they keep talking about this going to federal court, I had a brief conversation with the law department. We ought to figure out a way, the law department's looking into a way that we can interject ourselves into that civil action into a federal court. That's the only way it's going to happen. This is, if you look at number one, when you have the county and you have the city of Cincinnati going like in front of the editorial board of the Enquirer, who are they? I mean, they're like putting their case out. Do you need the editorial board to decide? Why would you do that? Like a couple of kids telling on each other down there. And the editorial board, I don't know where their expertise comes in, although they did break the story, which is another thing that I find amazing. That you mean to tell me nobody in that city and nobody in county knew that until Dan Horde put it out in the newspaper. And then as soon as they put it out, the fingers came out with guns almost. They were pointing at each other. It's not me, it's him. Go get him. I didn't do it. He did it. She did it. And it was one of those. Once again, our best interest is not being looked at. And here's the other thing. The state auditor conducted a routine review in 2014, noting several issues. None was deemed significant enough to include in the final audit report. How in 2 years we spend, how we blow millions of dollars get lost in 2 years? Or did they send somebody down there and say, hey, just give them a few information, they'll go away? Now, the state auditor has decided to conduct a forensic audit. It's amazing after 2 years, after a newspaper story. I believe, and I'm not an accountant, Mr. Stiss, I believe a forensic audit is one that they check everything. Every purchase order, every transmission, every email, every transaction that they commit, they look into. It's extensive. So, once again, here it is, they're out there spending millions of dollars. There was a city official, I'll let you look it up in the paper so I don't get myself in trouble, which I normally do. There was an elected official sitting in that meeting with his hand over his face with a smirk. You know what? If I was involved in a meeting and this city was involved in millions of dollars being lost or unaccounted for, I'd put a bag over my head if I attended a meeting. I wouldn't attend that meeting with a smirk. I think we have an obligation to our residents to answer questions, to do everything we can, to leverage everything that we can do to make sure that our best interest is covered. And if that means going to court or put money in escrow or being ready to interject ourselves into that court system, I think that's what we ought to do. Because this just didn't pop up overnight. This just didn't pop overnight. So when somebody says to you, if you look at your bill and find out just how much money, people say, my water keeps going up. Well, it's garbage and it's water and everything. Look at the bill. It's the sewer bill. We'll say you buy the water for 10 cents, it costs 20 cents to put it down sewer. And I totally understand that. But and Joe and I toured this town, looked in every crevice we can. The one time they said, well, it's all got to be separated. Our stormwater and our sanitary sewer and our combination sewers all go to the same spot. They all mix and they go to the same spot. And when it floods or you get a lot of rain, go down at the dead end of Harris Avenue and watch. They've tried to restrict it and try to put it down. But what can't be restrained goes right into Duck Creek. Yeah, it's a little gross, but they say, well, that don't happen. Take a rainstorm, and then when you get out and you see toilet paper in the trees, there's your first clue. So this is going on. It's a sham. I think people should do it. I think we ought to have everything to clean it up, and I totally understand it, and I agree with it. And I know it's expensive. My pet peeve is, and will continue to be, that our residents, our ratepayers, getting their money's worth. And are we, as elected officials, doing everything we can to make sure that their best interest is protected? I don't have a loyalty to Hamilton County. I don't have a loyalty to the city of Cincinnati. Our loyalty is the residents of Norwood. So I know there's a lot to cover, but in brief, that's where I stand. And once again, I thank the law department for having the patience with me, because I've been on a tear all week. This has just irritated me so bad. And I've told Joe from the very beginning, I believe it's an opportunity to right a wrong. I've been told, boy, you really want to stir up, you've been through that once. No, I want to do this. I think we ought to do it. I'm hoping that if we come to some sort of legal agreement that we can move in a direction, we can get the support of this council to do it. I would never ask anything or recommend anything, and I'm sure the law director wouldn't do anything to put this city's liability at risk. But then again, I also believe that we can't sit around like a bunch of sheep and get shoved around. We've got to look out what's in our best interest. So if you've got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Does anyone have questions of the mayor?
Thanks. Oh, by the way, the antenna, Tom McKay back there spearheaded the use of, when it changed our radio system, you probably didn't even notice the antenna down City Hall is now gone.
It was on the news.
It was?
I saw it on the
Well,
news.
that's pleasant. I mean, it beats the shooting. But we looked down, and they looked down on the plate today, and it was put up in 1945, I think. Where were you, 5 or 6, something?
It was a
Anyway,
twinkle in my father's
it was put up in 1945. And we was told, that thing's gonna fall down and everything. The cables all seemed pretty secure to me, didn't they, Joe? But it's down, and I want to thank Tom McKay for taking the lead on that and getting that accomplished for us. So, thank you much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. All right, we have no other requests to address council, so we'll move on to unfinished business. Any unfinished business? None? Okay, we'll move on to new business. Is there any new business? Mr. Clark.
I have two things if I could. We held our first prayer meeting on the steps of City Hall this past Saturday. We had over 40 people in attendance. 6 churches throughout Norwood were represented. Cameron Avenue Church of God, Trinity Pentecostal Church, Norwood Church of Christ, Grace United Methodist, New Haven Missionary Baptist Church. Also, Pastor James and his family were in attendance. Everyone seemed to really enjoy it, the opportunity to come together. We'll be holding another one the first Saturday in March, which is Saturday, March 5th this year at 1 p.m. on the steps of City Hall. So if I could, my second item would be Cameron Avenue Church of God is putting together, with the help of an organization called Hope Over Heroin. They're trying to bring this event to Norwood. I know they've been in contact with the police department to try to bring this. They're having a community meeting on Tuesday, February 23rd at 6:30. That'll be I know we'll be unable to attend because of council. But they are very excited about this. This is a nationwide thing. It started actually up in Hamilton, Ohio. They had the first event. It brings together churches, faith groups, as well as detox facilities and things to give people resources to get off of heroin. So again, they'll be holding their organizational meeting on Tuesday, February 23rd at 6:30 at Cameron Avenue Church of God, which is located at 2156 Cameron Avenue. So if anyone's able to attend and would like to, very interesting. You can go to hopeoverheroin.com to find out more about the event.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Is there any other new business? Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, I just have 2 things that I just wanted to say. First, I just wanted to thank the mayor and Mrs. Williams. They did an excellent job representing the city of Norwood at the Health South Hospital opening. I mean, you couldn't have asked for 2 better cheerleaders. So I saw it. I mean, you were in your element more than I've ever seen it. So thank you so much for that and for everything you do for the city of Norwood.
It was his wife, really. She was the star.
What's new? They were both great. Fantastic. And then I also wanted to thank Mr. Gears, Joe Gears Sr. There was an issue that I had spoken to him about a pedestrian button that just was broken. You couldn't cross the street, safely. And like 2 weeks later, it was fixed. So, Mr. Gears at Smith and Lafayette, appreciate your quick response on that. So, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mrs. Stickley?
I just wanted to let everyone know that we're going to be holding a Law and Ordinance Committee meeting tomorrow at 6:30 here to discuss the mobile signs.
So again, if that's Law and Ordinance Committee here in council chambers tomorrow night at 6:30 to discuss mobile signs. Great. Any other new business? Mr. Sanker?
Madam President, I would like to place in the committee of a whole the MSD issue that the mayor was referring to for discussion. And hopefully by the time we have that committee of a whole meeting, we may have some additional direction as far as some of the options available to the city from the law department, as far as some of the ideas the mayor had brought up. to see what some of our options are and how we would go about pursuing those and bringing those to the forefront, so.
Mr. Sanko, would you like us to add that on to the committee of the whole meeting next Tuesday? We could add that on and get a new notice out?
Yes, Madam
If that's
President.
sufficient time, Mr. Moore, for the background information?
Don't know yet.
Okay. So, could we resend out the committee of the whole notice, and so we will add that on as well for consideration next Tuesday here at council meeting at 6 o'clock. Thank you, Mr. Sanker. Is there any other new business?
I think so.
I think the meeting's at 6:30.
6:30? Is that what it is? 6:30? Whenever it is. Can you send that out again? Any other new business? I'd just like to report that last year, the Safe Routes to School group got close to $400,000 in grants for part of our school travel plan, and that money has been, the federal money has been reallocated again for this year, and so we are applying for another $400,000, so it's going to be much easier this time. We've already got the school plan, the travel plan developed, but we will be asking for $400,000 more this coming year. Yes, Mr. Bonzo.
And it's totally okay if the mayor doesn't have an update on this, but I was just curious about where the planning for the streets for the first $400,000 construction grant, is it by chance still being worked on, I guess, implementing? And we can wait till next council meeting too, there's no rush on. Okay.
The first amounts that were applied for were more like signalizations and stuff around the schools, and then there is some street work to be done in front of Williams. But we have just gotten those cost estimates back, and the state lets those out for bid, so we're kind of at their...
Okay, so we're on that. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for the update.
Any other new business?
Oh, I did.
Mr. Bonso?
Sorry, the original committee of the whole meeting went out as a 6 o'clock meeting.
That's what I thought. I thought it was at 6 o'clock.
I would have been there at 6:30.
I was pretty sure it was 6:30, but I couldn't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure it's at 6 o'clock. So 6 PM here next Tuesday, the 16th, February 16th. Any other new business? All right, moving on, we'll move on to communications. The first is a letter from the mayor regarding mayor's court fines.
Dear Madam President of Council, enclosed, please find the report from Norwood Mayor's Court for the month of January 2016. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Thomas F. Williams, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Mr. Clark,
Move that the report be received and filed.
seconded by Mr. Bonso. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. The next is a letter from the mayor regarding appointment to the Tax Incentive Review Committee.
Dear Madam President and members of council, the Hamilton County Development Center is charged with the Hamilton County Tax Incentive Review Council, CHARC, to monitor the compliance of active enterprise zone agreements and community reinvestment area agreements. Participating communities must formally designate 2 representatives to serve on the Hamilton County Council. CHARC members must be approved by council, and they must be residents of the Norwood community. Please be advised that I am designated John Hannerhan and Andy Conlon as the city's representatives, and I am requesting that you approve these 2 individuals to represent our municipality. Thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Sincerely, Thomas F. Williams, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Mr. Mumper.
Move the letter be received and filed, and we approve Mr. Hannerhan and Mr. Conlon as representatives.
Seconded by Mr. Sanker. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Our final letter is a letter from the mayor regarding executive session.
Dear Madam President and members of council, I am requesting that council go into executive session on Tuesday, February 9th, 2016, to discuss contracts. If you have any questions regarding this matter, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Thomas F. Williams, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Mr. Sanker.
Madam President, I would recommend the letter be received and filed, that council take the recommendation to go into executive session.
For the purpose of contract.
Contractual issues.
Seconded by Mr. Mumper. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We will go into executive session. This will require everyone to leave. We'll ask that the TV cameras be turned off and the volume turned off. We will come back into regular session to adjourn. We ask that everyone who is not on council or of the administration to leave the meeting. Thank you. Okay, we are out of executive session and back into regular session. We have no absent members to excuse. Mr. Clerk.
I move that we adjourn.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. This meeting is hereby adjourned.